Welcome to the IDPro Show, the best hub for hearing about how to grow your career in digital identity. I'm Heather Flanagan, Executive Director of IDPro and Principal Editor for the IDPro Body of Knowledge.
And I'm Chris Cochran from AKA Identity. We're here to explore the world of identity. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started in identity, this is your show for the gateway to the latest trends, knowledge, and career advice.
So today we're here to chat with David Brossard. David is the CTO at Axiomatics, a leader in fine-grained authorization. Now, previously, he was Senior Director of Identity Product Management at Salesforce, where he drove the design and development of Salesforce's customer identity solution. His main focus is IAM and API security, and he's published several papers, contributed to several books on API security, identity, and attribute-based access control. He is a contributor to identity standards in the OpenID AuthZEN group, OAuth, ALFA, and XACML. We'll talk about those, where he drove standardization efforts for developers in authorization-based access control. So if you go to identity conferences like Identiverse, Gartner, or EIC, you've probably heard David talk about authorization. So welcome, David.
Thank you. And I apologize if you had to sit through one of my presentations.
I'm sure it's not a bad experience whatsoever, David. I got to ask you, because we've had a few people on the show before that have been really focused on authorization. Why did that become your focal or your focus when it came to identity?
It was an accident. What happened is, it's funny. I was telling this story yesterday to another peer of mine. Many moons ago, I was supposed to go do an internship at Microsoft Redmond, and I'm French originally, so I had to get a visa to do that. And then around that time, I think there was some sort of like kerfuffle between France and the US, and French students were no longer allowed to go. So I had to find a different internship. And that ended up being in the UK at British Telecom in their research labs. I went and I worked on NLP, natural language processing, which I thought was super cool. I really love languages and how you can combine languages with computer science. Then the following year I went back because I had such a great time. And when I got there, they said, "Oh, we're sorry. We shuttered the NLP lab, but don't you worry. We're going to put you in security." And I was like, "What's security? I've never heard of security." But anyway, I landed in that lab, and the rest is history. We built a bunch of demos that were leveraging things like WS Federation, WS Trust, the whole WS Star. It was the beginning of SAML, of course. It was the whole idea of STSs and Federation and just one thing led to another. And after several years doing research, I got a little bit bored of just doing research. So I moved over to a startup, Axiomatics, and did that for 10 years. Loved it, building the business, talking to customers, understanding their use cases, their challenges. Authorization is not an easy space to be in. So it's challenging. And that's really cool because you get to like every day challenge yourself and try to find a way forward. And then 10 years later, I got a little bit not bored, but I was afraid I was going to be a one-trick pony, that I'd be the XACML guy, and I don't want to just be the XACML guy. So I went off to do consumer identity for Ian Glazer at Salesforce. And after a little over 3 years of that, I did miss you guys, actually, the IDPro crowd, the authorization crowd, the community, the conferences. And I was definitely not an expert in consumer identity. So I decided to go back to authorization and see where it goes.
So backing up just a minute, what is authorization? Because I hear about policy language, I hear about access control architectures, I hear about runtime controls. So where does a new identity person even start learning about what is authorization?
It's both simple and not that simple, right? At the end of the day, the way I like to distinguish authentication and authorization is that authentication is really proving something about yourself. It doesn't have to be your identity, right? Typically, when we authenticate, we're thinking that we're proving that I'm David, right? But actually, I could be authenticating a claim about myself. I could be saying, "Oh, I'm 21. I can drink." The bartender doesn't care who I am. They just care that I'm 21 or 20 or 19 in Canada, right? So that's authentication. It's proving something about yourself. And different forms of authentication are going to give you different levels of assurance. If it's a username password, well, are you really who you say you are? If there's a passkey involved, it's a bit better, and so on and so forth. Right? There's different degrees of authentication. Authorization, on the other hand, is okay. Once we know something about you or who you are, What do you think we can do with that information? What systems can you access? What data can you consume? That's authorization in the broad sense. The unfortunate thing is that there's a lot of standards out there that abuse the word of authorization and by accident, I'm going to say
Mm.
HTTP 401 is unauthorized, but it's a failure of authentication. So it shouldn't really be called unauthorized in a way. OAuth, the web, I keep forgetting the real name of it, but it's the web authorization group. I think I keep forgetting what it stands for. But that also is not really about authorization. It's about access delegation, right? In OAuth, the main use case is I've got system A, system B. I want system A to access my information within system B on my behalf, right? It's access delegation. Authorization in the way that I see it is really about, oh, there's something that someone wants to get access to. That something could be data. It could be a function. It could be a feature. It could be an app. It could be an API. We're going to try to figure out whether that person, when I say person, doesn't have to be human. It could be a process. It could be a client. It could be many different things. We're going to figure out whether that person has the right to do what they're trying to do on that thing. That's authorization. And I did not talk, you'll notice I didn't mention policy or graph or access control lists or whatever. We can get into that later, but it doesn't matter. Like the definition of authorization doesn't care about the how.
Yeah, learning about that, that's fortunately, you've written, quite a bit on this space, and just for ID Pro, I went back and looked at our history, and I think you've written, like, 6 blog posts,
Mm.
including the State of the Union of Authorization in 2021, Unauthorized: The Comedy of Errors in 2023, most recently, the updates from AuthZEN, just this month in 2024, which tells me I really need to get you to write for the body of knowledge, but, I'll harass you about that later. But
I've been bad at
with
that
so
actually.
many with so many posts on authorization and so much written already, what are you writing next?
Historically, when you look at what we did as a company and what I was thinking as a person, from 2010 to say 2020, we were very much Mac driven. And let me explain that. It was just that we thought authorization is all about mandatory access control, Mac, and we thought everything was about policy. So there's a policy that dictates what can happen. For instance, a doctor can view the medical record of a person. That's very Mac minded, if you will. But there's a whole new set of companies out there, and there's new frameworks, if you will, like Zanzibar, that are saying, well, hang on a minute. You also have to handle DAC, discretionary access control, which is where a user wants to share an item with another user. And there really isn't a policy driving that. For instance, if the three of us wanted to collaborate on the Google Doc, there isn't a corporate axiomatic policies dictating that I can or cannot share a document with you, right? It's just that, I wanted to share something with you because I'm working on this podcast. So that's discretionary access control. And so what we're seeing in the evolution of authorization is that it's no longer about the Mac side, it's also the DAC side and how you combine the two, right? So Google came up with this model called Zanzibar. A bunch of new startups are implementing that model. OffZ is one of them. Signal, I think, is doing that. And so for me, it means defining the next generation of what an authorization solution would look like, combining both Mac and DAC. It's not going to be either one or the other. It's going to be both. And so that's what I'm looking at in the future.
I love it. I mean, you've contributed to numerous standards as well, right? Let alone the blogs and stuff that you're doing for ID Pro. I mean, one of the things about standards is like you can have the most awesome standard in the world, but if no one adopts it, then it's almost for nothing. What are
Yeah.
some of the big challenges when it comes to mass adoption of certain standards, in your opinion?
That's a great question, Chris. And it's something I've been wondering a lot about. If you look at the standards that I was involved in particular, ZACML or XACML, right? Created in 2001. I like to call it a sibling to SAML because they were both created in 2001, both at Oasis, both in the wave of the WS Star standards, right? So a lot of the WS Star stuff, I think, happened at W3C. For some reason, SAML and ZACML ended up within Oasis. And SAML had the success that we know it's had, right? It's everywhere. And although a lot of us claim it's dead, it's still, alive and maybe retiring little by little. ZACML did not have the same level of success. It is a successful standard from a quality perspective and from, fitting the bill perspective. But from a mass adoption perspective, it hasn't been as successful as SAML, right? And why is that? I tend to think the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. And what I mean by that is, if I look at it at that fence, on the one side, you have all the identity folks, the identity management, the federation stuff. And on the other side, you have the access. And if you look at federation, if you look at identity management, all of these standards, be it SAML and of course OAuth and OpenID Connect, but also things like SCIP, right? They're a one-sided equation. They all are in the hands of the identity teams within a company. And so it's relatively easy. I'm sure my friends and peers at Auth0 would laugh at me if they heard me. It's relatively easy to implement identity in that there's one stakeholder, there's one clear owner for that product stack or technology stack, which makes it easier to roll out and deploy. So if
Mhm.
suddenly an enterprise says, we're going to do SAML for federation, right? Or single sign-on, um, sure, there might be detractors saying, no, we don't want to do single sign-on, but the benefits are clear and the ownership is clear. With
Mhm.
XACML and fine-grained authorization, the challenge is that there's a lot of benefits, but it's a two-sided equation, right? So one side, of course, is the identity team, but the other side is the application team or the data team or the API team or something else team. And that's the struggle, right? You're no longer dealing with a single clear stakeholder. You're dealing with multiple stakeholders. The benefits are there, but there's a lot of orchestration and coordination that needs to happen. And then the drivers might not be as clear. When I was at BT, 15 years ago, I remember CA put out a joint white paper with BT because they just sold SiteMinder to BT. And the use case was, well, it used to be that employees at BT would have to remember 30 passwords. And of course, people forget passwords, right? So
Mhm.
they would have to have password resets and a help desk, and they would handle 1,000 resets a day, or I don't know the number, right? But they costed it. They said a password reset costs $30. So if you have 1,000 a day, that's $30,000. If you have 200 working days in a year, it's 30 times 200. $600,000. So that's a huge number, right? And I remember that white paper said over so many years, you're going to save $15 million. That's a clear, easy number, so it makes it easy to justify why you want to go down the path of say SAML or identity technologies. Doing that same math for authorization is not as straightforward. Some of the benefits, are going to be saving time for the developers and all of the competitors in this space. We're all saying the same things. You're going to save 20%, 30%, 40% of your development time. But it's not as it's not as hard set a number as you're going to save so much money by going down that path. So there's a lot of other things that come into play, but definitely the fact that authorization is a two-sided equation is the number one challenge to its adoption.
That was a perfect answer. And let's double click on the future for a second.
Yep.
If you look out, take out your crystal ball and you look 5, 10 years down the road, if you had to make one bet about the future of identity, like what would that one bet be looking forward?
Ooh. I'm somehow hopeful that we're going to get to a point, and maybe this is a scary point, but we're going to get to a point where we have enough systems listening that we know preemptively or just in time whether an interaction is legit or not legit.
Hmm.
And if you think far enough, sometimes I think, and maybe this is very, very far fetched, but sometimes I think that if we have enough systems listening and understanding what's happening, it's almost as if you didn't really need authorization anymore because we just know that you're supposed to do that or we know you're not supposed to do that. Right.
Right.
So, that goes to user behavioral analytics, which I know very little of, but the whole principle of, looking at a user, understanding what they're doing and figuring out
Hmm.
whether it's a legit use case, that's interesting. And that doesn't really require any authorization policy or any identity gimmicks. It just requires that you're listening and understanding what's happening. Because some of the threats that I'm interested in are more on the insider side of things, which are harder to get.
Hmm.
Because if you are an employee, or by the way, a legit customer, it doesn't matter, right? It could be an external identity. But if you're a legit person, you can always go rogue one day. You're
Right.
disgruntled or you're changing jobs and you want to steal data, which you shouldn't be doing. But these are things that you were allowed to do because you were in the right position. You had access to the data. So sure, you can do it. And so authorization policies are not going to catch that because it's a normal use of your credentials. It's a normal use of your entitlements. And the only way to really catch that is to realize that, well, hang on a minute. Every single day you access one record. Today, you're accessing 100 records. And there's three possibilities. Either number one, your job mission changed, so you really do need to get access to 100 records. Or number two, you've become rogue and you're stealing data. And
Hmm.
God knows why you've become rogue. Maybe you're leaving the company. Maybe there's something else. Or number three, your identity is under attack, right?
Right.
But either way, we really need to know why that's happening. And that's, I think, the more signals we have, the better we're going to get at that. And really interested in seeing what the shared signals working group at OpenID is going to do,
Hmm.
because they're working on that, and they're
Yep.
working on being able to produce those signals, which in turn authorization products can consume to make better decisions. Right.
Yep. You used the word scary. Why do you find it scary, or why did you label it as scary?
I mean, it's kind of the whole dystopian thing. If machines or humans or processes are listening to your every move,
Right.
how much is too much? There have been
Hmm.
these stories, even pre-COVID, but also during COVID, of employers taking random snapshots of your screen so that they know you're working. There's that type of monitoring. That's scary. You should trust your employee, but at the same time, you like if you're an employee in a random company and you have a CRM and you notice a change in data consumption in that CRM by a particular employee, that's a signal you want to act on. Clearly, you want to know that the person is not acting the way they should be. And your first reaction should be, oh, maybe they're under attack. Maybe their identity is unhealthy and we need to help them. Like the first reaction should be, let's help the employee because there might be something wrong. On the consumer side, of course, it could be and banks have been doing that for a long time with, more or less success, right? If a person is getting cash from an ATM in, say, LA, they can't possibly be getting cash from an ATM in New York, an hour later, right? So these are signals that you can leverage. The flip side, of course, and I think in retail, they've been a little reluctant to use those signals because they would rather do business than impede business.
Hmm.
If you get the signals wrong, you might be preventing someone from buying stuff, which actually is
Right.
what happened to me back in February. My credit card decided that every single payment I was making in France was not legit. And so they claimed they called me. I never got the call, and I was stranded in France with no money.
I had as you one of the more common signals that we talk about is very, in a way, it's very human centric. The If you're taking out money in Los Angeles, you couldn't possibly be taking out money in New York an hour later unless you've
Right.
learned how to teleport, which, as far as I know, no one's really figured out on a mass scale. When you start looking at non human use cases and the signal of, okay, it's this region's cloud that suddenly lit up and then it exploded into other clouds, and that because it's Ticketmaster and it's a Taylor Swift concert
Mm,
and everyone's suddenly buying it. Those signals of normally it would only be in region A and then suddenly explodes to all the other regions. That's that's actually now not a valid signal of, is this, a legit
Hmm.
action or not? And I think we're gonna see some interesting challenges to start to differentiate where humans and non-humans overlap, what's a valid signal and what isn't.
right. And you're opening the door to non-human identities. So we got to keep an eye out for the standards in that space. We're opening the door to workload identity. So Whimsy, a new standard at IETF, they're working on some of those challenges. But you're also opening the door to something interesting. When a process is doing something else on a process, they're usually doing it on behalf of a user or a consumer or a customer or an employee, right? But oftentimes in those
Maybe.
systems, the original identity might have been lost. And so we don't really know why the process is doing that in the other process. But what if we could trickle the identity down the stack so we always know in the context of whom or in the context of what the particular interaction is taking place? Because that would be super cool. Like if process one is looking up data in process two, then the fact that process one and process two can talk to one another, fine, that's plumbing. But the fact that process one is doing it on behalf of Joe or Alice, that's way more interesting because it's going to help us be more secure and more intent.
Agreed, unless Joe or Alice is the name of an AI.
True.
Because
How do we know that?
that actually is a legit scenario, coming. If it's not here already, it'll be here by tomorrow.
Yeah,
Hmm.
absolutely.
Let's keep talking about standards, because since you and I are at the IETF meeting, it's our mutual favorite thing. You've been a pretty vocal advocate for the adoption of standards like the OpenID AuthZEN and
Yeah.
XACML. Now, I'm an organization that's trying to do the right thing, and I'm starting to explore these standards. But starting from reading a spec is probably not the easiest way. So, what
All
advice
right.
would you give them to actually get them started in being compliant and interoperable? And how are they supposed to avoid the common pitfalls?
Yeah. So there's a few places that people can go to. IDPro is actually really, really place. Not wanting to, tout the IDPro horn too much,
No,
but
tout it, tout it.
I'll tout it then. It's a great place because it's a good mixture of vendor and non-vendor, of systems integrators and organizations. So it's a good mix. Number one. Number two, because you do have a lot of, if not all of the vendors, you get the different points of view. So even if I'm biased towards my view of the world, you're going to get Signal come in, or you're going to get Three Edges come in and say, no, 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 David, that's not the way we do things. So you're going to get a mixture of views, and that's important. And of course, you get, things like the body of knowledge and a lot of other material that has been peer reviewed and that is really, really good quality. So that's one thing. Another place you can turn to, if you happen to be in a regulated or in an organized vertical, let's say, that has vertical specific standards bodies like FHIR and HL7 for healthcare, like FAPI and open banking for banking, turn to those folks because they have patterns that they specifically designed for those industries, leveraging standard to some degree. As a bank developer or program manager at a bank, I shouldn't care whether we're using OAuth or SAML because that's like too technical for me. But I know that I'm compliant with open banking version 2.3, which happens to dictate OAuth or something else. And that's what you should care about. It's the vertical standard that's going to get you further, and people in your space that have thought through these challenges. So that's what I would do, as a customer organization is find those common places. If you go to the specs, if you go to IETF, if you go to Oasis, the specs are really hard to read. I do want to say
Mhm.
that OpenID AuthZEN, one of the mandates that we have is education and design patterns, and we're really putting a lot of effort into that. It's I'm going to say it's the softer side of AuthZEN, as in we're not producing a spec. It's not a formal thing, but we're teaching people, hey, this is how you should be tackling authorization. These are the pros and the cons, and so on and so forth. And that's important because we want to raise awareness of authorization.
We're stronger together. Definitely have
Exactly.
to use the community for sure. All right, you have a choice. You can either go hero or horror. Give us one of your favorite stories and identity, and you can go the knight in shining armor route, where you tell a hero story, or maybe it's both. Maybe it's horror that turns into hero. But would love to hear a story from you.
So the horror story is many years ago, we Axiomatics was pitching the product to a retail company and a nationwide US retail company. And that retail company says, well, we realize we have an authorization challenge. And the reason we realize this is the way we're structured is we have a sales employee and we have a sales manager. The sales manager cannot get commission. They only get, they assign commission to the sales employees, right? And that's the thing. The sales employees cannot assign commission, but they receive commission, right? So that's the separation of duty based on the
Hmm.
role. However, we also have a trainee sales manager role. The trainee sales manager role is for someone moving from the sales employee position into the sales manager position. That trainee role inherits both profiles. So they could both
Wow.
receive a commission and assign a commission. And the way that particular business had been built is that a sales manager could close a sale. And if they did, the commission would go to sort of a gold pot and would sort of go back to the company, but that money wasn't really tracked, if you will. So they didn't realize that money went missing if someone suddenly said, "Oh, I'm going to assign myself that commission," which is what the rogue employee
Hmm.
was doing. They were assigning themselves a commission that would have gone to no one otherwise. So the employees didn't complain because they weren't missing their commission. The company didn't complain because they were not measuring the amount of money not being paid out as commission. And the only way that person got caught is, the first month it's a monthly payout. So the first month they find themselves one commission that would have gone back to the company under the radar. The second month they do three or four or five. I don't remember. Right.
Hmm.
And we're talking thousands of dollars, but he only got caught because they every so often, every quarter, every whatever, they would do a review of the best salesperson. And the way they
Oh
did that is they
wow.
counted the number of commissions that they were tracking. And
Mm.
suddenly this person who'd been an average person, they had three times, four times, five times the amount or the numbers. It's not even the dollar amount. It's just the number of commissions. The solution
That's
from an
crazy.
authorization standpoint, of course, is to do dynamic SOD. So you put a policy saying that you cannot assign yourself a commission and then end of story, right? Which RBAC, role-based access control, can't really do.
So you got to let us know, how can people keep up with the stuff that you have going on, and are you going to any conferences or other events for the rest of this year?
So at the very least, I'm going to 3 conferences. Going to Authenticate Con in October in California. So this is the FIDO Alliance conference. We
Mhm.
are going to have, this is actually very unofficial. So a sneak peek, we're going to have an AuthZEN interop. I'm also speaking at the conference on the topic of authorization. The reason of us being at Authenticate Con, us, the authorization community, is that you want to look beyond the authentication horizon. You want to look at what's next, and what's next is
Mhm.
authorization. So that's one. I'll be at Gartner IAM in December or November. I can't remember, in Dallas.
December, yeah.
I'll be at Nordic API Summit in Stockholm as well, talking about API authorization. If you want to follow all of this, we do have a volunteer-led newsletter that we publish every week called, it's a Substack. So it's authz.substack.com. You can sign up. It's free. We're about, I would say 10 individuals contributing to the newsletter from a wide range of companies and parties. So we have Cellpoint, Axiomatics, Signal, and a bunch of other companies contributing to the newsletter. So it's bipartisan or neutral, and you can get all the latest on what's happening in the authorization world and beyond.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for taking
Hey,
time out of your busy schedule to hang out with us for a little bit. Thank you to everyone that's watching or listening to this. And definitely thank you to IDPro and AK Identity for allowing Heather and I to go on this crazy journey through identity so we could bring you as much knowledge as possible. And with that, we will see everyone next time.
thank you.